All right, we are live with the Deadly Analysis podcast. In case you don't know, this is a place where our conversations about horror films are they're kind of otherworldly. That's one way I'd put it. It's a place where we take a moment once a week to come out of our shell and discuss our fears, our pods, if you will. Trying my best to lay this on thick. We critique ourselves in light of the films that we find frightening. That's what we do here. This is a place where we shun people who like movies like The Bye-Bye Man and Annabelle. And we actually go like this. We point our fingers at them and go, like that. We do that every time we find someone who likes Annabelle. And so this week we are actually discussing the 1978 horror film. We'll probably jump between the three different versions of this film, but in particular we're going to hit the 1978 horror film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which has like an all-star cast of Donald Sutherland, Jeff Goldblum, Leonard Nimoy, Brooke Adams, and Veronica Cartwright. And we basically follow these folks as the people of San Francisco slowly but surely become assimilated, maybe the best word I can think of, and replaced with dull and emotionless versions of themselves, thanks to an unseen and unnoticed alien invasion brought about not by flying metal ships, but by spores, of all things. And so I'm here today with Antonio, Shayra, Ben, and Garrett, and I think this was Antonio's third film to pick in his list of great horror films to review. His first being Sunshine, his second being The Wicker Man, the original Wicker Man. I always have to clarify, not the Nicolas Cage version. Please know that. So it's at this point where I really want to mention this before I hand this over to Antonio. Like, I think we're starting to get like the fear schema for Antonio. We're starting to see what scares him in his three films. So let me throw this out there. Let's see if I'm right. The ramping up, paranoia, nothing as it seems, anxiety-laden, loss of control sort of vibes throughout his films, throughout his selections. There's always like an isolation within a context of like a vastness in the films that he selects. So, right, like in Sunshine, it's the vastness of space juxtaposed with the isolation of like the Icarus and what's going on in the Icarus and everyone dying and everything closing in on him, right? In The Wicker Man, it's like this open island filled with free spirits and people with an openness to extra canonical forms of spirituality juxtaposed onto a protagonist that has very stark and strict religious convictions. And in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it's an entire city and indeed possibly an entire world that gets closed in on, as it were, by this alien presence. The world as we know it starts to become smaller and smaller, and people get podified and they get replaced. And this giant city that we all know of as San Francisco effectively becomes smaller and smaller as the humanity gets choked out of it. So anxiety and paranoia and like the ramping up of isolation generally within a context of vastness. These are all things that I'm starting to notice about Antonio's films. So far, all of his films to me feel like some form of a person is alone in a raft in the middle of an ocean dying of dehydration, right? All that water, but nothing to drink, right? It's all this openness, but totally alone, right? Very interesting. By the way, it's $300 for that analysis, Antonio. You owe us $300 for that.
For that deadly analysis, he said in joke form.
So that's how I'm starting to grasp these films that you selected. I could be wrong, right? So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Close.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to
one facet.
Okay. So I'm going to hand it over to you and you can tell us what that is and tell us why you chose Invasion of the Body Snatchers as your film to discuss.
All right. So the one facet that you missed, you got almost everything right. The one facet that you missed is that it's not isolation in the context of like a raft in the middle of the ocean dying of dehydration. It's a raft in the middle of the ocean dying of dehydration with two other dudes who are slightly bigger and stronger than you and are getting really, really hungry. That's the kind of isolation. It's not isolation as a sole individual human being. It's isolation in a context of a progressive social breakdown. And what gazing into the abyss does to the human psyche in a social context. You know, as you look at your fellows and you see them gazing into the abyss too, and you know not all of them are going to be as strong as you or will react the same way. And then you have to figure out how you're going to try and stay alive in that situation and stay sane in that situation. So that's why I like a lot of Lovecraftian horror as well. And that obviously ties right into Invasion of the Body Snatchers. If there ever were a well-executed Lovecraftian horror movie, it would probably be either this one or John Carpenter's The Thing. Those are the two that really come to my mind. And so This movie I actually don't particularly like on a philosophical level. I don't think that it has a particularly interesting conversation about the state of humanity. It seems to be some sort of analogy to McCarthyism in kind of a strained way, you know, that being suspicious of your neighbors and, you know, everyone trying to be conformist and stuff like that. And, you know, people betraying each other and getting converted over. Could also be an analogy of cultism. But the thing that I really find creepy about this particular movie is not only how people are taken over, but also just the grossness of it. It's got a body horror element to it where the threat is much more advanced and powerful than we are. It's depicted as an alien race, but they explicitly shy away from flying saucers in a way that's interestingly sort of presages. I don't know if presages is the right word because it was already in production, but Alien came out the next year and also defined science fiction monsters as icky again, rather than as these, you know, little men in flying saucers. And so the body horror aspect of this, like I said, is I think only paralleled by something like Alien or something like The Thing. You know, there are these gross plants that are sort of biotechnological, if you will. And they're incredibly insidious because where can you go in the earth? You can go man retreats to the city, right, in order to escape from the wild. But what if the wild is and then he brings the wild back in with him once he feels the isolation. You know, the plants are a sign of often prosperity. You know, you often see people growing gardens when they have leisure time and some extra resources to commit. So these are things that we isolate ourselves through urbanity, and then we bring back the wild back in, and then the wild eventually eats us. It's kind of like the body horror sci-fi version of Jurassic Park in a way. And so for that reason, it makes the list. Not only is it just, you know, very well performed, it doesn't have a happy ending, which is something that I appreciate in horror movies, and it's an interesting twist from the original, which does have a happy ending. You know, they do beat the aliens in the end. But rather than for its plot necessarily, this one makes the cut because of its deeply unsettling nature, and also for the deeply unsettling, like, camera work, sound work, the ambiance that this film generates, much in the same way as The Wicker Man.
Can I jump in on a response to that? So you said a lot of interesting things. I mean, I would reject the interpretation of thinking of it as Lovecraftian. I think that you know, sort of the hallmark of Lovecraftian horror is precisely that it goes well beyond your capacity to wrap your head around. It's super rational, whereas I think the plot of Invasion of the Body Snatchers is quite comprehensible. I think they do a very nice job of explaining to you what the aliens are, what their motives are, where they're coming from, and so forth. But that's perhaps nitpicking. I do find it also strange that you said you don't really like it philosophically, but you had that nice little thing in there about plants and about how we, you know, and I thought that was a nice read. That seems pretty philosophical. But the key thing I want to jump in on, and again, I imagine this is going to be something we'll come back to a fair bit, is this the McCarthyist interpretation. You know, the idea that, you know, everywhere you turn you see communists, and you know, the neighbor next to you is becoming a communist. I read, and I think it was in Stephen King's Danse Macabre, I could be wrong about that, but I think somewhere I read that the author of the novel, Jack Finney, explicitly rejected that interpretation. He said it had nothing to do with communism. Now, again, that doesn't mean, of course, you can't read it that way, but I found it very interesting that he at least was sort of baffled by that particular reading of it. But that is, and again, even though he denied it, that is sort of what I've always thought was sort of the standard interpretation of the story. And I actually just watched this film just last night for the first time. I thought I'd seen it before, but I hadn't. And what struck me was that the way I read it was that it wasn't really about communism. You know, by '78, of course, the communism was still a thing. But to me, it seemed much more about human relationships, in particular, intimate human relationships. You know, we have the lead characters are having an affair, and then the dentist boyfriend, you know, sort of becomes the first sort of captured alien being, which no longer and starts to become alienated. And there's this whole repetition about my husband is no longer my husband, my wife is no longer my wife. You know, there's so much sort of, you know, about sort of the physical intimacy of the characters and the relationship, you know, the sexual relationship in the characters, you know, again, it's the 70s, so we're through the summer of love. We're no longer in the 60s, you know, but we're still in San Francisco, which of course is my hometown, and it's, you know, very much a place where it's sort of the spirit of free love, even through the 70s, was still sort of hanging on, and to a certain extent still is to this day. And sort of so then what way I read the film was about this idea of, and Leonard Nimoy has this whole sort of speech in there, right, about how when people say my husband's not my husband, what they're really afraid of is that relationships are sort of too transient, that people change within them, they jump in, they jump out, and we no longer make connections with people. And you know, so that was sort of the overarching sort of philosophical aspect of it that I took out of it, that it was sort of not necessarily a critique, but an analysis of, or reflection on, how human relationships have changed in between the 1950s when the novel was published and the 1970s when the film was released. From sort of view of where people, you know, you get married at 18 and you stay married the rest of your life, and by the 70s, you know, again, divorce was on the rise, free love was more popular, and so human beings would, you know, we would connect with more people, but we would connect in a more shallow way. And this idea that you never really know anyone, you never really love anyone, that they always change, that to me seemed to be what I found most philosophically interesting about the film.
Yeah, Tonio, specifically, what did you find Lovecraftian? There was a lot going on there, but I was curious what specifically you thought was Lovecraftian, and then what did you think about Garrett's interpretation? Mine's a little slightly different than both yours, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
The Lovecraftian element to me is that all right, several elements. First of all, I agree with Garrett that incomprehensibility is a significant element of Lovecraftian horror that is certainly absent in this film. I wouldn't describe the film as overall a Lovecraftian work, I don't think. It certainly has a number of Lovecraftian elements, but I don't think that the overall idea is the same sort of bottom line as Lovecraft, which is to show, you know, the howling abyss that is at the heart of nature. This doesn't really show the howling abyss that is at the heart of nature. It doesn't even really get at the howling abyss at the heart of man, which is, of course, how we see the howling abyss that's at the heart of nature. The Lovecraftian elements are that your doom is already among you. It has come from the stars. It has all kinds of tentacles. You won't notice it as it insidiously infects your midst and infests you. The infestation, the theme of infestation is very strong in Lovecraft's work. And that what will it destroys your mind inevitably. There's no recourse against it. You know, once you will eventually succumb to it. You have to sleep eventually. They will continue to replicate themselves and take over, and it annihilates the human soul, which is a core element of Lovecraftian work as well. Once you are remade in its image, there isn't anything left of the original you that was fighting the good fight.
Yeah, and I'd like to underscore the catalyst for this is sleep. I think that itself is somewhat Lovecraftian. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, but sleep, when you think of sort of, there's a unconscious or maybe a subconscious process going on that's doing the transferring of podifying you, right? And a lot of Lovecraft stuff hits on the unconscious or the subconscious, right? It hovers around that in a lot of the short stories. And in that sense, the transfer of being who you are to that loss of individualism, essentially your death, and becoming of this other emotionally just non-existent thing, is done through sleep. It's done while you're unconscious, which I think also is a bit Lovecraftian.
And there's enough of you left over that you can identify as yourself and identify as yourself to other people, and yet you don't even know there's anything wrong, but it's horribly wrong. Everything is wrong about you. There isn't any you left, even though it seems to be you.
And that's actually what I think this is about. Is I think there was a couple of ways we could probably cut this in terms of what we're looking at. One is collectively as a society. There's commentary that we could do that way. But I think to me this film struck me as more on an individual level, like the loss of individualism through. And you got to think about this again. It's almost impossible for us to cut this from the fact that this was a 1970s film in San Francisco, right? It's that place where it's the home of artists and eccentrics, and I think there's a kind of counter feel to this film as a response to things like communitarianism, and we think of the 1970s. It's referred to as the me decade for a reason. It's the kind of it's a response in a lot of ways to a loss of a cultural identity, and I think that's exacerbated by the fact that this is taking place in an artsy city like San Francisco. And I think there's something like that hovering around this film, but I see it as at the individual level. I mean, I think there is some social commentary there about groupthink and things like that. McCarthyism, that didn't strike me. It's probably because I'm not well learned enough to be able to like have that conversation well, and I don't know too much about the ins and outs of all of it. I mean, I know like high school level shit about McCarthyism, and that's it. But to me, this sort of struck me as a loss of self, a deterioration, almost a disease element, losing what makes you you, that sort of thing. Yeah. What about Shayra or Ben? What do you guys think?
So I went into this not knowing anything about Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but I had watched other movies that I didn't know, totally borrowed from this kind of trope. And so when I first started out with the 1950s version, which was on Netflix, I decided to watch that before I went to the 70s version. I was like, oh my gosh, I've already seen this before. Like, I've seen this story so many times in so many different places. Most recently, I watched the TV show Brain Dead, totally borrowed from this storyline. And when I watched the 50s version, it was a lot more about the social conformity, a lot more about groupthink, a lot more about the horrors of everybody just being a little off. Like, there's just barely something wrong with them. And you're like, yeah, they're exactly the same person. It's just not the same person. I know it's not the same person. Everybody's like, but they have the same memories. They have the same scars. They have the same everything. Yeah, but it's not the same person. No, it's not the same person. I just know because I know them. I have this feeling. And I felt like that was a very important aspect of it, which they did delve into the 70s version. But like this feeling you get with people. Like, you know that person because you felt them. And I think the way they tried to portray that in the 70s version was with a kiss. I don't know, like I know that there's like touching, you know, like when you get intimate with someone and they just feel weird and off. I really like this aspect of the film and how they've done it throughout other TV shows and films. This idea that we know someone so intimately that nothing is going to be able to, you know, block off what you know is that person. You know how they make you feel. You know how it feels to be with them or to touch them or to like talk to them. It was really not as subtle in the 70s version. These people were weird as fuck. They were walking around like staring and doing weird things and dressing differently. I kind of like the idea that it looks and sounds and is just exactly the same person. So that was the only part of the 70s version that I didn't like. The rest of it was fantastic. It was grotesque. All this goo and boogers and mud and bubbles and nasty stuff. I loved it. The smushing of heads and blood splattering. Just great.
And it's PG, right? Isn't this film PG? That's insane.
Yeah, it was really gross. I was like, ugh. Like, I kept going, ugh, cringing. Like, that's nasty. But I think the best part was when I saw the plants kind of going like this towards their bodies, and I'm like, oh my god, Evil Dead. I'm sold. This is so Evil Dead. And I loved it. And this is the thing that really made me excited. They always talk about how when you borrow from something and then turn it into your own thing, that's how you can really make a beautiful, new, creative work. I feel like they've done the 50s version really well in all these different remakes, and I found out they're going to be remaking this again. I don't know how good it's going to be, but I'm excited anyway because I think this is one of those tropes that you could really do a lot with. I mean, Star Trek did something with this, with the Borg, so it could go so many places. I love it.
$100. The next remake is going to have a critique. It's going to be from a technocratic perspective, that it's going to be the loss of self from a technocratic perspective, from the little phone, little thing like this, right? That's what it's going to be. $100 right now. I'm calling it.
Since Shara, since you bring up again the whole I don't recognize this person, I know that person. Are you guys familiar with the Capgras Syndrome? This is a real condition, and it's absolutely fucking horrifying. It's basically precise. I mean, I don't know if the Jack Finney heard about this syndrome because it does predate the writing of the novel, but it seriously seems like one of those ripped from the headlines kind of things. Capgras Syndrome happens. It's a neurodegenerative condition in which you see a person that you know well, your husband, your wife, your father, your son, and even though they look exactly the same, the person is convinced that they're an imposter. And it's just really, really bizarre because again, it has something to do with the way emotions are registered in the brain. Like you say, Shara, when you see the person that you love, you're accustomed to having this feeling of warmth or something like that. And somehow that sort of just gets switched off in the brain, apparently. And so you see the person, but you don't feel that feeling of love. So you become convinced, just completely convinced, that they're someone else who's taken over their body. It's well documented. There's all sorts of cases. There's sort of famous cases that are sort of written up in this in the neuropsychology literature. And it's one of those things where, like, again, there's so many weird things. It's like if they talk to them on the phone, they will think that they're the person. They'll believe they're talking to their husband. But then the person can walk around the corner still on the phone, and they'll be like, nope, that's not my husband. That's an imposter right there. And you simply can't rationalize them out. You can't make any argument to convince them that they're wrong, because it's just that powerful and that hardwired. And it's the kind of thing
that is truly horrifying. I'm just gonna throw that out there.
Yeah, it's really scary. I mean, thankfully, it's exceptionally rare. Apparently, it is more common in women than it is in men, but still, even in women, it's exceptionally rare. So it's unlikely you'll get it. But if you get it, your life is gone. It's just that you're fucked. It's terrible.
I think the thing that makes me so uncomfortable with that is that you would like forever be living as the main characters in these films, where they're like trying so hard to convince everybody this is going on, and everyone's going to be rationalizing, because every single film, even the 50s version, had like a doctor rationalizing it, trying to be like, no, that is impossible. This is you're just experiencing this, blah, 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 blah. And they're so wrong, It's not until they see the plants where they're like, well, that's weird.
That was the scary part of this to me, I think. Well, one of the scariest parts was just when they're all in a room talking about it, it sounds so crazy. You know what I mean? It sounds nuts. And trying to explain this to any other rational person, you can't really do it without sounding crazy, right? But you're right. So imagine being in a scenario where you're right, you just know it, you are right, and there's no real ample way to explain it to someone without sounding insane. That is itself kind of a horrifying thing. I mean, you could take that and move it outside of Invasion of the Body Snatchers into maybe a ghost movie or a zombie movie or a vampire movie, and it's still just as scary. There's something really horrifying knowing that, I don't know if it's like an egghead thing or you have the right answer, but there's no way to get it out in a way that is going to make anyone else believe you.
But this is why this series of all of the different ways that this has been written is so much better than all the other horror films that try to have someone be a skeptic, right? The skeptic is always an idiot. You watch all these different movies, the skeptic is like this idiot. You'll show them all this evidence and they're like, oh, come on, ghosts aren't real. Even though you have all this evidence showing that clearly, like, something will fly past and they're like, clearly that was a breeze. Like, no, dude, that's not a breeze. Like, making it flip in circles and having a clown attack your child and being sucked into a tree. Like, I'm sorry, there's something obviously happening here. But, like, with this, there's no evidence. The bodies disappear, or like any kind of evidence absolutely disappears. So the rational skeptic person is actually thinking straight, is actually being rational.
I think that brings up a fascinating sort of general question about epistemology, right? And again, there's the scene where Leonard Nimoy, who is the skeptic in this, right, again, is being told by 3 separate people that they witnessed this. And there's a fair question there. At what point is it rational to say, okay, here are 3 people who I know they're reasonable people, they're fair people, they're not delusional, but they're all telling me something which seems impossible. Obviously, hardcore evidence would be more convincing and better, but at what point, how much testimony are we willing to accept? And this, of course, can bring us back to all sorts of things like miracles and stuff like that. But this question of sort of social epistemology is a fascinating one if we wanted to delve more into the philosophical side of that.
I don't want to overtalk, but I do have something to add to that. That is a really important thing to point out, but we should also note that Leonard Nimoy was one of the fucking pod people, and he was trying to fuck with their heads, too.
Ah.
So...
I didn't want to spoil that for anyone if they haven't seen it, but
oh no, we spoil the shit out of every single movie we do.
You've been warned, we spoil.
Yeah. You better not be watching this if you ain't seen the movie. Yeah.
But like, yeah, he was trying to mess with them at that point and make them feel insane and make them question if they've lost it. But with the original, the OG one, they all thought he was insane until they found out that some pods had fallen out of a truck in a car accident. A pod comes down the hallway, and that was when the people he had been talking to and trying to explain this to the whole time went, wait a second, all right, everybody, let's go and get those pods. I mean, that's, the rational person, the second they saw the evidence, was like, all right, let's go and take care of this issue, and then they were able to take care of it. So that is what's so important about this, is because the skeptic is not a dumbass. The skeptic,
I think it was his glove. I think Leonard Nimoy's glove made him think non-objectively. You know?
Yeah, what the hell was up with that glove?
So the story is, I looked this up on IMDb just because I had to know, and the story was that Leonard Nimoy specifically asked to have that glove. It wasn't supposed to be in the film, but he asked to have it as a way of him standing out in the film as having, just as a way of separating himself from all of the other characters in the film. That's literally the entire reason that glove is in there. He just kind of wanted to be like, oh, when someone says that person in the movie, they're referring to the guy with the glove. And there's some reason he offers for this, that there's another film that he saw that reminded him of this, that he was like, oh, I always remember that character because he had this thing on his hand, like a glove. And that's the reason, which is a really shitty reason.
I don't know. That seems like an actor tradecraft kind of thing. Maybe we should hold off on making those sorts of judgments unless we have.
Yeah. Let's get Scott in here. Scott comes in with like a glove, like a Michael Jackson glove. What are you guys talking about? Yeah. That's a good question though, Garrett, because it comes down to Warrant, right? Like I was thinking the same sort of thing. I was thinking about Warrant when they were all in the room trying to explain this, and they're all kind of sounding nuts. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so my wife comes into the room with a bunch of her friends, and they start explaining this. And they're all rational people for the most part. They're all rational people, and they're talking to me and giving me, and I'm hearing this. Let's say I'm an outside observer, and I'm hearing everything they say. And I know my wife very well, and I know her friends very well, and I know my friends very well. And I'm hearing this, and I got to kind of fight a couple different things. I got to fight the way in which I see the world objectively, the way that I view science, the way that I understand arguments even. All of that has to be taken into account in conflict with the trust that I have with those around me. And maybe that may not even entirely be true, because there is the possibility that they could just be something, there's an error, a cognition error on their end, something that they're not privy to or aware of. So that has to be taken into account. So the question becomes, like, I guess I'll just ask you guys, like, if you were in that scenario and these were all people that you really knew and trusted, and they're intelligent and they're professionals, and they come to you and say something like this, what do you do? Is your initial gut, before you clearly ask them for some sort of evidence or you do the explaining, what is your initial gut feeling if this happens to you with, say, your spouse and your most trusted colleagues? Like, where would you land initially?
Let's hear from Ben.
Yeah. I'm curious what Ben thinks.
Yeah, the psych guy. What is this? Come on, Ben.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So to answer that question, I don't think it would be rational, honestly, to take somebody like that seriously, who comes to you and says, there's this problem. Everyone looks the same. They're not the same. How can a rational person listen to that? Even as a person who maybe can look at the evidence and kind of respond to that in a way where you believe them. Because, I mean, honestly, if you think about what Garrett said, right? So there actually is a disorder, Capgras Syndrome, and you have that sort of like to fall back on. And I think that's a really interesting point about psychology and taking everything to that point too, is because anything that sort of falls outside of your expectations and the norm is immediately turned into a disorder in some ways. And to even expand on that, though, there's actually something cool that I wanted to mention called prosopagnosia that sort of takes that a step further. And whereas Capgras syndrome sort of like maps onto the movie exactly, this is a little bit different, but essentially what happens is you entirely lose the ability to recognize faces even. And that even applies to your own face, right? Like if you look in the mirror, you can't recognize even your own face. So like there are these sort of conditions out there that we could say, okay, well, if somebody comes to me with this problem, well, it's clearly got to be that, yes, it's very rare, but I have this little box to push this into because I think your cognitive sort of architecture there is just going to be so resistant to any kind of massive shift like that naturally you're going to reject it. And I don't think you would be wrong to do so. So that sort of goes to maybe one of the things that I find most horrifying about this movie, perhaps, is because when you have a threat like that, I mean, we really have no way to kind of respond to it. Like if it was a ship, if it was a spaceship coming in, or like a destroyer, or an army, you can respond to that. You know how to respond to that. But there are particular kinds of ways of attacking a society that there's no really good way to respond to. And in fact, the best way that you can respond sort of plays right into the problem.
I think actually that really quickly, a quick aside, one of the things I was disappointed in the film was that, you know, they tried to give you a sense that they were gonna fight back. You know, Sutherland says several times, you know, we'll beat them, but there's never any sort of good faith offering on the part of the filmmakers as to how they're going to do that. You know, they never like find something that might be, oh, we found a weakness that they're going to exploit, and then fail to do so. Like I think that would have upped the tension, would have upped the stakes if they had an element like that in the story, so you could sort of, you know, red herring that would make you believe that it might actually work out. But it's pretty clear going in that this isn't going to end well. It's either going to be a Deus Machina, or it's going to be a bad ending, a pessimistic ending.
He did try to blow up 1/10 of like 0.1% of their pods, Garrett.
Right. But yeah, no, prosopagnosia, face blindness. Yeah, that's it is another real condition, which is going to be at least tangentially sort of related to the whole thing.
So there are people actually living in like Invasion of the Body Snatchers right now. Like that's they live with things that are similar to that. That is, I don't want to live in this world anymore, guys. That's Jesus.
But to answer your question, Noah, I mean, I think for me, and again, it's sort of, I take this sort of base pragmatist sort of thing about it. The key thing isn't, should I believe it or shouldn't I believe it? The key thing is, what do you expect me to do with this? If you're telling me that I need to pick up a gun and start shooting people because they're pod people, fuck no, I'm not going to do that. Not on the safe, not the three people I trust most in the world. I'm not going to pick up a gun and start shooting people because they're pod people. Okay. But if you want me to say, put you in touch with the mayor, you know, which is actually what he ends up asking him, yeah, I would do that. You know, I mean, I realize that I might burn my social capital with the mayor. I might create professional problems that I might be passing on this potentially ludicrous idea. But, you know, But
you would trust enough to actually do that.
Yeah, to put someone in touch with someone else I knew, someone like the mayor. Yeah, I would trust them enough to do that. But I would be clear to the mayor, look, I'm not saying what they're telling you is true. I'm just saying that I think you need to hear them out because I know them, I trust them. Maybe they're crazy, but if so, we've got an epidemic of crazy going on. So maybe it's not pod people, but something fucking weird is going on, and we need to start by paying attention to this. So I think the wrong question to ask is, do you or don't you believe them? The right question to ask is, what are they asking you to do with this? And then does it pass the threshold for whether or not you think it's enough to do with it or not?
That's fair. That's a good response.
Yeah,
I like that.
actually, in the original 1950s version, that is precisely how it was dealt with. They were all aware that the town was having an epidemic of people having some kind of thing that made them crazy to not believe that their family members were their family members. But the thing that really concerned the doctors who were looking at this, because they knew it as an epidemic that was happening to the townspeople, is that it lasted for only a couple of days, and then all of a sudden everything was fine. That's where the real concern came with the doctor, because the original main guy was a doctor, not a health inspector. And he was like, I am really concerned about these people's psychological well-being, because how could they all be under this delusion and then it fades? So he's trying to figure out what's wrong with these people, what the epidemic was. Is this some kind of cold or virus or something that can affect other people outside of their own town? So I thought that was really just ahead of its time in overthinking how we, the audience, might start to ask questions ourselves about this fantasy story. You know what I mean? That's probably where all of us rational people would go, is like, oh, maybe they're just all delusional or all going crazy. We should look into that. So, yeah, I think that they went right along with your thought process, Garrett, you know?
Definitely this movie made me really appreciate being a health inspector. I feel like they had so much power in the 70s. That's one of the things I was like, man, this guy walks around town like he's the cock of the walk, man. Like he was doing
parkour and shit, like leaping all over the place. I'm like, dude, this could be a video game. I would play it too.
So the parkour is actually probably because he appears to be a vegetarian, right? The only time we see him eat, he's having like ginger and celery. Clearly, that's what it's got to be. Just to like jump in on one point though, that you were talking about, Shara, that actually made me think of what you might refer to as kind of like a mass hysteria, right? So you know there is actually this real thing that can happen to people where there will be this sort of group level, extremely obsessive behavior or thinking or action. I think I mean, this is probably, I mean, sociologists have studied this for a long time. I'm sure this is probably, this terminology has probably been around long enough for it to have been maybe an influence into the book. But, you know, one of the greatest examples of that is probably going to be the Salem witch trials, where, I mean, yes, there's like a clear explanation as to now we know why, like maybe there were some hallucinations or something like that. But in a few cases, you know, that can balloon up to people killing other people because of ridiculous claims that there are witches.
But here's the thing, is that really wasn't ridiculous back then. I mean, it's ridiculous to us today, but, you know, for much of European, much of Christian history, the idea of the belief in witches was sort of par for the course there. I mean, Salem witch trials were ugly, but it's nothing compared to what happened in Europe a couple of hundred years before, you know, all the way up through, you know, the Spanish Inquisition. You know, it's right there in the Bible, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So in that context, it seems perfectly rational that, you know, someone says that person's a witch. You know, if you were there, if I were there, the smartest, most rational people, had that upbringing, that background, they would have believed that.
That's totally fair. And I guess if you had something like that in this movie, you know, maybe humanity would have had some sort of a defense, right? Because, like, obviously in this case, the body snatchers would be the witches. So maybe it's not such a bad thing after all. So, you know, I don't know how to really weigh that out, whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing. Clearly it seems like a bad thing. And yes, like maybe being rational, I don't know. I mean, that sort of clashes with what I would see as rational to a response, or as a response to somebody coming up to me and saying that, well, you know, everyone in this town has been replaced by an alien. You know, I don't know. It's there's some clashing going on there that I guess, like, in that time period, rationality would probably sort of be based largely on religious belief. You know, if you genuinely believe that set of beliefs, then yes, I mean, I suppose it would make sense to kill a witch. But maybe if you don't believe in, you know, alien spores coming to the planet, it's not so rational to kill people because they're from, like, they're alien spores.
And I mean, again, this is not to beat the point home, but if a person really insisted on evidence, it seems like one of the things you can do is say, have you noticed the total lack of emotional affect in all these people around town? You know, don't you think that's something that needs to be accounted for? Isn't that at least, you know, strange? So on top of the testimony of 3 people, you also have this clear pattern of people losing their emotional capacities.
And then you can always point out, why the hell are the garbage men coming in the evening? Like, why? What's happening here all night? This is different.
With ashy black straw stuff always in the back, not garbage bags.
Yeah, and I was kind of puzzled about that. Why did there need to be this big conspiracy to cover up the remains of the people, right? I mean, it's like...
Well, I think the movie really tries to account for most of our expectations. So, like, you know, when it creates a new pod person, you obviously, it's part of the point of the plot that the pod person is created, you know, in the same room or in the immediate vicinity, so that you could conceivably wake up and see it and freak out. And so something has to happen to your body after the pod person replaces it, right? Your body, and even if your body, like, crumbles to dust, it's not just literally going to disappear. Even if it crumbles into some kind of, you know, ashy substance, you're going to have to get rid of it. And so the movie sort of plays to our expectations, you know, in asking that. And honestly, I think it does a pretty good job of doing so. There's only one notable scene where I would say that's an exception, and that is that apparently they let Leonard Nimoy back to look for the body without actually going with him. And that was the element that I thought was the single least believable bit in the movie. Is you've just seen this, like, crazy growing fetus body thing. You totally flipped out. Leonard Nimoy arrived and wants to take a look at it. And instead of leading him over, you're just like, it's in the 3rd stall on the left. Go in here. We'll close the door here. Go check it out. And then he comes back and, you know, 5 minutes later and is like, there's nothing here. And then the window's open. And of course, you know, we, the audience, realize he's a pod person and he obviously disposed of the evidence. But I was kind of disappointed that the movie didn't think to make the characters a little more skeptical there.
I also thought the cinematography in that scene was weird. That was a scene where, again, we had this high up shot looking at all the different sort of curtains and so forth. And, like, you know, there's an important conversation going on, and you can't see any of the actors' faces. You can't see their emotional reactions. You know, it was a very strange choice of shot.
That's perfect, because I want to add, I think the reason for that is just any attempt to explain the disposing of the human corpses is a really distinctly 70s thing, or an older horror movies thing I'm noticing. Antonio from the very first podcast sort of imprinted on me this idea that he said watch older, when we do the older 70s movies, watch for these specific things, right? Watch for the camera giving you more of a story in transitions, and this film has that like you would not believe. So if we take this film and go look at the one in 2002, 2003, I think, with Nicole Kidman. I forget the year it was made, but yeah. And you'll see things like when the camera is showing you that characters have transitioned to another setting, it's just a jump cut. Whereas this film was one of the most obvious differences is that you travel with the characters in this film. You travel with them in a state of one long transition between sequences from different settings. And I think that sort of cinematic thing is part of the explanation for why they even attempt to show you what happens to the human corpses. They want sufficient explanations. They want you to be able. I'm trying not to get on my soapbox here, but this goes into one of my main criticisms with modern horror cinema today is that they don't do any real work for the most part. And this is a generalization, but there's a problem with horror movies today where they don't explain things between transitions. They just kind of jump. They jump from one scene to another and leave a couple questions in your head. At least the 70s and 80s horror attempt to give you an explanation. Because if they didn't, we'd all be sitting here going, hey, what happened to the bodies? Do you ever feel like why? It didn't make sense to me, right? This film tried to give you an explanation, and I agree with Antonio. It did it in a way that was actually pretty unique. I mean, I don't think it was perfect. We can envision scenarios where it would be problematic. The film exploits a couple of those, like what happens when a character's sitting there and degrading and eventually turns into dust and all that, yada, yada, yada. There's problems with that, but at least it's an attempt at treating you like a rational moviegoer that's going to think, hey, what happened to that corpse? I feel like we don't get that.
I felt
today.
like it was a bit of an attempt at being humorous. Like, I could imagine a laugh track every time there was a garbage truck smashing the stuff. Like, ha 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 ha, oh, you pod people. Like, every time I saw it, I kind of giggled. I was like,
dun, 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 dun. Yeah.
I think
I don't think
those represent a contemporary concern for the process that is kind of lacking in modern cinema. There's a lot of concern in the earlier movies to show you the process.
I think it's not just horror movies. It's movies in general. I've seen several critics comment this about how movies today are much more fast-paced, in no small part because audiences today lack the attention span and the patience. They're watching their movies on their cell phones. They're half distracted. So the films have to keep grabbing you and re-grabbing your attention in order to keep you engaged. And so, but at the same time, though, I think that can be an advantage to modern films over the older films, because especially I think like the third act of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I felt there was a whole lot of just go from point A to point B, and then point B to point C, and then point C to point D. And it's like, what is the objective here? Where the characters are trying to get away, okay, but there's no clear idea about what it is that they're trying to do. And again, so back to my previous complaint.
But it's panic. It's panic. I think that's the answer, Garrett, is it's panic. That's what it wants you to see through giving you all that.
Panic isn't plot. I mean, again, it's emotion, and it's powerful, and again, it covers that well. But,
oh my God, he's a pod person. He's trying to take away our emotions.
But, I mean, really, I felt that they could have had their cake and eat it too. Again, I felt that if there was a clear objective for the characters other than just get away. If they could get to this place and do this thing, they could start fighting back, and they could find this person. If there was something beyond just escape, that especially that final third act would have felt like it was actually going somewhere rather than just Donald Sutherland just running from shit.
I don't feel that would have been as scary, though. I think part of the fear for this is that you have nothing but just what do I do, and you run in circles. Like, that's part of the appeal, and that's never more apparent in this film when they're all in that apartment. And that phone call comes in, and they're all like, and they look outside and they see the police, and everything's kind of collapsing in on them. That is what made it scary. If they had an objective, and I think you mentioned at the part where Donald Sutherland has something like a kind of objective where he goes and destroys all those pods. That was the least, the thing I liked least about the film.
But
the thing I liked.
I don't want them to actually achieve the objective or even sort of necessarily get their hands on it. I just want them to talk about it, to say, if we can just get to the island, then we can be safe there, or if we can get to the headquarters, we can create a disease that will kill the population, just so there's the notion is there in their heads rather than just run here, run there, run here, run there.
I actually think that this is a core element of the movie's plot, though, and that is precisely that the tragedy in this movie is that the thing that is worth fighting to preserve, which is individualism in this case. You know, clearly the message of the movie is is like an individualist versus collectivist kind of mentality. You know, the things that are worth preserving are the things that make you, your high emotions and your low emotions. And leveling them all out in the service of someone else's overarching plan is the ultimate horror. And so the heroism is individualism. The thing that's worth fighting to preserve is the individual, and yet it is the individual that is unable to prevail against the sheer organization and manpower of the collective. And that's the tragedy of it. It's fatally undermined by its own uniqueness. It is unable to organize and coordinate and execute as effectively as the opposition.
You know, that's really interesting. And there's one scene that I think that abstracts that really nicely. And I was hoping to have kind of a segue to sort of talk about this, but we do have that scene where it looks like they're in a party and Jack and Matthew are sort of talking over each other, right? So Donald Sutherland's character is on the phone trying to talk to the police, but Jeff Goldblum is there insisting on talking about his own intellectual concerns in his book, and they're kind of like overlapping each other, and it's chaotic. And in the background, you actually have this funhouse looking mirror that sort of distorts Jeff Goldblum's face. And I think that's meant to portray that it's meant to be sort of surreal in a way, because they're taking that staunch individualism and kind of like just showing you its fatal flaw. So yeah, I think that really plays into what you're saying there, Antonio. And also like just a fantastic scene, just mind blowing. It was so good.
I mean, we want to sort of stop, and again, Shara mentioned again other films that have and other stories which have sort of taken a page from this, but it's worth. And again, I was doing a little background research. There was a cluster of stories that came out around the same time as the original novel that sort of played off this same thing. But I think the one that dated back the furthest, again, which might be arguably the progenitor, is the John Campbell story, Who Goes There, which was the foundation and the inspiration for The Thing from Outer Space, which later became The Thing. I'm not sure if it was the first, but it was the first story that I could find. That one came out in the 30s. But then by the time you get to the 50s, yeah, you have that. You have Invaders from Mars. You have what was the other one? Yeah, there's a handful of other films that came out literally within just a couple of years of each other, all playing off this same theme. So, at first I thought Invasion of the Body Snatchers was the first one, and that all the others were stealing from it. But then when you actually look at the timeline, it's a little bit more crowded and confused. So it's hard to know exactly who got there first, if anyone. It's fascinating. We sort of, there's such a thing as an idea whose time has come, I suppose. And then the early late 1950s, this idea of people getting taken over, swapped out, controlled, seemed to really be something that there was a serious appetite for in the public.
They were highly paranoid times, and I'm sure that played a significant role in it. And of course, it's also not inconsequential that this was during the era where genetics became a big thing that was discussed widely on the national scene.
Yeah, I feel like this is truly an American film. Like, this embodies all that is America. And there was a really great animation that I believe was done by the guys who did South Park in Bowling for Columbine. And it was kind of their joking way of talking about America and like how we all think here. And like the way that our American history has always come from paranoia. We're always paranoid about something. Something is scaring the shit out of us. And we just need to shoot at it and make it go away. And so this film, I feel, just completely embodies our culture of constant fear and constant worry about any possible thing to pop up and happen here. So I felt like it might go over some people's heads in other cultures. I don't know if it would, but I feel like it was a very American horror film.
There's that classic book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. I can't remember who wrote it off the top of my head. Hofstadter, I think his name was. Which, yes, definitely finds a lot of evidence in favor of that idea. That's sort of the defining characteristic of America is our paranoia. But regarding the South Park thing, Columbine, I actually think that it wasn't done by the South Park guys, and they were really pissed off apparently. Because again, in the film, it's right after the interview with the South Park guys, and yeah, stylistically, it looks very much like South Park. But apparently, the filmmakers had their own people do it and put it there without any kind of thing saying that who it was by. And so the South Park guys felt like they, so that they sort of try to steal their bit and attribute it to them. So if that's true, again, I'm not entirely 100% sure it is, but I have heard that's the case. So
that's interesting. But I did still find the animation really accurate.
The substance of the piece is definitely on point.
This movie wouldn't have been as horrifying if those ultrasound noises weren't in it. Those ultrasound noises, man, that did something like basic to me.
Noah's never having children now after seeing this.
I'll never be on the fence about it again after seeing this. Just hearing the ultrasound noises.
Is the scream that they make?
Oh, no, not the scream they make. That's like the Banshee scream. Shira does a really good impersonation of that. But no, the when they're being when the person is asleep and the pod thing is happening and the process is happening, it's the sound of an ultrasound. It's throughout the whole film, and it's actually someone in the film's baby. I forget. Like they took their ultrasound. They were like, "Hey, I got an ultrasound." Like it was one of the actors or someone on the staff basically had they had a recording of their ultrasound, and they used it for the sound at least in the '78 version. For the noise that happens when you should go back and listen to it, Garrett. It just, I mean, it's an ultrasound. It's like white. It's like a weird white noise. I mean, you know what an ultrasound sounds like, but like
the best part about this is I was watching it while I was on a Skype call with Daniel, so he could not see what I was watching. He was playing his video games or whatever, so and that's how we hang out, being so far apart. But all he can hear is these ultrasound noises and all these weird, creepy noises. I think it was when he fell asleep outside that it was going for a good 5 minutes. It was just weird, creepy noises. And Daniel's like, "What the hell are you watching?" Like, he just couldn't take it anymore. He was like, "What the fuck is that? How could that be interesting?"
This is actually one of the things that I really enjoy about this movie, and one of the things that I think sets it apart qualitatively from a lot of other horror movies. And that is that the design of the movie is kind of bipartite. There's an aspect of the movie where they just craft the set, they craft the acting and the sequences and so on. But in the cinematography and the sound design, they are both quite deliberately and specifically sort of ratcheted up in order to produce a sensation of disorientation. And this is particularly evident in the camera work. If you watch the camera work carefully, you will notice a heavy use of Dutch angles. There's a number of times when the camera rotates from a skewed sideways position into a regular position. There's a number of times when the camera does 360s and 180s and various other kinds of really sweeping, twisting movements to disorientate the viewer. There's a lot of framing of shots. Someone has already mentioned, I don't remember who, but someone already mentioned there's a shot where you can't even with the mud bass where there's a really, I think it was Garrett, where there's a really high up shot and you can't even see the characters talking as the shot is progressing. There's a number of choices made at almost every point in the movie where they deliberately arrange the camera in some way that's just a little off, that's just a little bit not correct as far as framing of the shot. And this produces that feeling of pervasive disorientation during the movie. And it's honestly something that I wish more modern horror movies would do. Most modern horror movies are shot in a very film school kind of way. It's a very, very direct, by the book, what's the corporate officer going to want kind of shot, and there's not a whole lot of creativity in stringing shots together to set a tone. And you see this often in like critiques of modern movies. They will complain about how horribly edited they are. This is a really, really well edited movie as far as the cinematography goes.
Two things I absolutely love about 70s horror movies. First off, the film stock. That sort of color saturation that you get in films like this one or Rosemary's Baby or Don't Look Now. You know, I love the texture and feel of the film. And second is the sound. They have this, again, all this, a lot of Dario Argento's films are like this too, right? There's just this pervasive soundtrack and pulsing background, which is just creepy as fuck. And yeah, I think there have been films who have tried to sort of copy the sound, and I think modern films, but they don't do it terribly well. But I would love to see a film done with 70s film stock again, a horror film done, you know, with budget. I'm not talking an indie film. I'm talking a big budget horror film that actually takes that original 70s film stock, or at least something that approximates it closely, and to recapture that texture, because I love that so much.
Just to ask a question really quick. I know The Void wasn't a high budget or anything like that, but I know they at least tried really hard to kind of like go back to that kind of like practical effects thing. And I'm not, maybe I don't remember it correctly, but I'm wondering if that would be an example of that, you know, where I think it was created purposefully because of sentiments like what Garrett has just expressed, where there's something lost when you go from kind of like that old way of making horror movies to what we currently have now.
Yeah, that's actually a real. I was going to ask if anyone had an example of any film like that, and The Void is probably the closest thing to an attempt to do that purposefully, I think, especially with practical effects. But your guys are right that the camera work on this, it made me feel very frantic. Like it sort of enhanced the paranoia of the film, and a lot of the shots I thought they just looked handheld, almost like literally just a dude holding a camera running around. I got that vibe a couple places in the film. It just made everything all the more frantic, which I totally dug.
Also, the cinematographer is just a creepy ass dude in general. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the janitor that you see buffing the floor a couple times in the movie, that's the cinematographer. There are a ton of like little cameos.
He is creepy as fuck then, because I was noticing him every time he popped up. I was like, you. I don't know about you. But I think there are a lot of good films that do try to go to that time period. I feel like Boogie Nights was one that attempted to try to, you know, really capture a space and time then. But it is a hard thing to do. You know, you have to try to get the right cameras, the right people that have that same mindset from the 70s. It's a hard thing to pull off.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not easy.
Someone send this to Sam Raimi. Sam Raimi, your next task has been set for you.
Drag Me to Hell actually might qualify too. I think at least not fully, but at least in that ballpark of trying to do that same kind of horror film. So
I was gonna say it's a little bit early for the time period that you're probably looking for, Garrett. But honestly, Darkman has a lot of that same kind of look cinematographically. Speaking of Sam Raimi movies,
it's been a while since I've seen Darkman, but yeah, Ian Neeson is a superhero who can not only take on people's faces, but also magically learns how to copy people's voices just by listening to them. That was a little some weak writing right there on that one. But I remember that film and I enjoy that film.
Yeah, if I had that ability, I would be a stand-up comic with it. I would be able to make millions. So
let me throw this out here to you guys, see what you make of this, if anything. As I was watching it, something occurred to me that someone could interpret this film in an incredibly kind of racist way. Especially again, there's that one scene where he's in the dry cleaner, and the husband says, you know, that his wife isn't his wife. You know, there's some sort of ethnic stereotypes going on there. But more broadly, I mean, you could take this idea again, like the Muslim invasion, right? You know, that these people who aren't us, they're not American, they're coming here and they're taking our jobs and they're taking our women and so forth. I personally don't find that interpretation very compelling, but I can imagine someone reading it that way, and especially was the 1970s, or was, you know, I think probably not uncontroversial to say a more racist time, especially or the 50s version even more so. What do you guys think of that?
That would underscore Antonio's Lovecraftian interpretation. Just going to throw that out there.
I don't think you're the only person who thought that, because we had a recent movie that has a very similar kind of trope with it called Get Out that came out. And I think that is his interpretation of that that whole thing. So I don't think you're the first person who thought of it that way. Yeah.
That horror movies take ethnic stereotypes and use them as the other to scare people?
Well, it is interesting to note about this movie that despite it being set in an era where having a black sidekick was the in thing. I don't know if you've noticed about like late 70s, early 80s movie and cinema, but it suddenly became, you know, after the passage of civil rights legislation and the ultimate victory of that sort of legal battle, it suddenly became super cool to have black people in your movies, but not as protagonist. You still couldn't sell a black protagonist yet. And so the black dude would be like the sidekick, or like one of the dudes who ends up getting killed at some point in the movie. And you see this in a lot of like late 70s, early 80s movies. You see this in Alien, you see this in Predator. Those occur quite prominently to me. And there's various other, especially action movies, where you can see this same sort of thing manifest. And it's interesting because in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, of course, I don't know. Are there any like prominent black characters? I don't think so. And the only
just Jeff Goldblum, and all I could think of was that Jeff Goldblum was like the sidekick character kind of guy in this movie, and I thought of Independence Day, and I'm like, is this just his like? He's always playing the same damn guy, probably ever since that film. I don't know. But,
and of course, the Chinese folks are inscrutable and depicted as, you know, fairly obvious stereotypes that were probably kind of offensive even to some people in 1978. Like, it's pretty bad.
And has anyone else noticed that apparently Jeff Goldblum is immortal? I think he really is a pod person, man. He's got to be like, what, 65, something like that, and he looks just a little bit older.
He is gorgeous. He is gorgeous.
Yeah, he's a good-looking dude.
I'm just saying. Jeff Goldblum, if you're watching this.
Hey, gun to my head, I wouldn't say no either, right?
Okay, I have a question now. If you guys are done with that piece, I have a question. This has bugged me, and I want an answer from you guys. Of all the songs that they could have played at the end, right, when Jeff Goldblum goes in, why is it Amazing Grace? I have a really, really esoteric, probably completely inaccurate interpretation of why that is, but I kind of want to know your thoughts first.
All I could tell you is that song, Daniel was like, okay, I hear all these weird noises forever, and then I hear Amazing Grace. Like, what are you even watching?
Ultrasound, Amazing Grace.
Like, if you just listen to the movie, apparently, without any visuals, it is the weirdest fucking film. I'm not sure why they have it there, but it definitely was something Daniel was like, okay, this movie is officially the weirdest thing you've ever watched. It has to be. I
asked myself the question, like, why, like, of all the music they could have played, why?
Destruction of hope is what it represents. You know, the idea is that this is now salvation. You know, salvation is at hand, and then it dashes your hopes. You know, and again, this is the sort of Lovecraftian element where, you hear the strain of some, familiar hymn, and you are attracted to it, and you go, now all my work is going to pay off in some meaningful way. And then as you watch, you realize that it's just another tendril of the great old one reaching over to you, and the whine of the bagpipes turns into a maddened screech, and then you're like, ah!
So, I mean, can we sort of flip that upside down, though, right? Could it be a quasi sort of critique of religion, this whole idea, after all, in sort of many standard traditional afterlife stories, when you go there, you do sort of become one with God and with everything else, right? You do sort of lose your individuality, and you do become assimilated in this Borg-esque fashion. I mean, again, I'm shooting from the hip on that one. I hadn't given any deep thought to it, but, hearing you...
I like that. That's interesting. Actually, that goes into a big part of this film for me. On a personal note, I feel like when it comes to our skeptic community that we've hung around in for years, there's this idea that we all need to be very rational, logical, skeptical of everything. Certain emotions aren't allowed. Quit putting emotional responses in any of your arguments. And it's this very robot kind of viewpoint. And we run into this with the original Star Trek with Leonard Nimoy being a character who was just kind of had none of those human emotions, but struggled with a bit of them. He has a little bit of humanity in him. You even see that in the modern Star Trek movies that have come out as of late. But there's like this struggle of needing to figure out how you become that rational person, but also try not to be too emotional about everything. In our circles, it's like emotion is evil almost. Like, you're not allowed to have any kind of emotional response to stuff. So when I'm watching this, I'm like, I feel like this is the attack that I'm constantly under. Everybody will call me emotional about certain things, and I'm like, I think my emotions are what makes me human, and I kind of want to hold on to that shit, dude. Like, quit telling me to stop having emotions. I have them. And
Richard
so,
Dawkins is a pod person. We just nailed it. This is...
No,
Yeah.
Sam Harris is the pod person, man. He's the Zen master, right? He's
Oh.
the guy who never gets upset about anything. Dawkins can get childish and churlish quite
Yeah.
a lot.
No, Harris. That's totally true.
Harris is the Zen master, man. He's the one who never gets upset.
See, this is how I know I'm not a pod person, because anytime anyone says anything about Sam Harris, I immediately feel all-encompassing rage. 100%.
So, well, actually, Shara, since you bring that up, let me sort of try to sort of play devil's advocate here and take that a step further. Why exactly are we so convinced that the pod people are the bad guys, right? I mean...
That's true, but that's how they paint themselves. I mean, they're going to take away your hate. They're going to take away your fear. They're
Right.
going to take away any
That
of
is
the
such a good
problems.
question.
But it also takes away love and all of the things that really just makes us connected as a society. If all that we're connected with is like groupthink and
Right.
nothing else is leading us to be connected, that is ultimate horror to me. Like,
And like I
oh
said,
my fucking God.
I agree with you here, but I'm trying to play devil's advocate because I do think it's an interesting angle to consider, right? I mean, maybe it would be worth it to give up love if you get rid of all the pain and the heartbreak that comes along with rejection and lost love and the death of people that you loved. You know, if we could have world peace, if we could explore the universe together, right? Which that's something that's kind of awesome. You know, it takes away.
Is this a greater good argument then? Like, is it
Sign
for
me
the
up.
best?
Sign me
Yeah,
up.
I guess you could make it in those terms. I wasn't quite thinking in those terms, but you know, I mean, emotions are a big part of us. That's true, but they're not all of us. You know, there is a lot more to us besides these sort of powerful, heightened emotions. We have other things that make life worthwhile, and if the aliens could offer us those things in abundance, maybe it actually is worth sacrificing.
Should it be a choice then and not be forced on us?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point, right? But we're keep talking about assimilation, but again, there's a difference between the pod people and the Borg, right? I mean, you know, the Borg, everyone sort of becomes one, but in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, people are still individuals. They're connected to one another in a way that human beings aren't. But you know, they say we still have our memories, we still have, you know, our sort of our personality, just sort of subdued in lieu of these connections to the rest of the species. So yeah, I mean, peace, harmony, connection, these things are valuable too. These things are human values.
Well, I don't think that's honestly too much of a devil's advocate argument, to be honest. I mean, it does make a lot of sense. And I think the way that we can sort of connect that, or at least I can, is to go back to that point when somebody mentioned that this is sort of uniquely American in horror. And, you know, as we know, horror movies are really good about being a mirror, right? Too. They really show you things about yourself based on how you react and what you're afraid of. And so something I think that is incredibly ironic about sort of the unique aspect of being an American as it relates to sort of the human condition is, yes, like we definitely emphasize individualism. We exonerate that myth of the exceptional individual, but we also have that strong collectivistic element too. And that sort of goes back to the Amazing Grace thing with religion. You know, yes, they're using that song that's traditionally played at funerals to sort of usher in the death of humanity. And what more collectivistic element of American life is there than our very sort of conservative religious roots, right? So, I mean, it's definitely there, and it might sort of depend on what you focus on. Now, I'm not going to say that, you know, this sort of development in particular of making everyone a pod person makes us collectivistic in the same way, but it's certainly making us collectivistic in a different way, which is why I kind of think that also that if you don't look at this as a horror film, if you try to take yourself out of that perspective and look at it maybe from a different perspective, you're seeing it as sort of a small group of people fighting against what is ultimately progress. And obviously, you know, progress being what progress is, there really is no choice in that matter either. You know, humanity is going to change, it's going to move forward, and there's really nothing you can do about it.
You know, I've been sitting here trying to think, is there any version of this story in which it's not told as, you know, it's a terrible thing? And I realize the only one I can think of off the top of my head, at least, is that Rick and Morty episode where they have that whole sort of collective consciousness sort of thing. It's like, you know, they're clearly playing off this idea that when you assimilate species, it's supposed to be horrifying, and they make it mundane. You know, they make it just, this is the way this species works. And yeah, it might seem horrifying to the people that they occupy, but for them, it's just life. It's just how life goes on.
It isn't taken to the same extreme, but there's a similar subtext at the end of the movie Equilibrium, which I have an absurd like for, despite the fact that it's not a terribly good movie.
Oh, it's a great movie. I love that movie.
Yeah, I know, right? It's actually a pretty good movie. It's underrated. And one of the interesting things about the end of Equilibrium is that the conceit is that humanity suppresses its emotions. It basically voluntarily makes itself Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You know, you voluntarily inject yourself 3 times a day with this drug that suppresses the highs and lows of your emotions and makes you this kind of even-tempered individual. And it creates this extremely collectivist, extremely conformist society where art is actually destroyed as, you know, something that triggers subversion. And so, but at the end of the movie, one of the things is that they kind of make the point that for most people, they should be allowed to experience the highs and lows of emotion. But there are some people who need to be able to check those highs and lows in order to be able to protect the rest from the excesses of their emotion. The balance is not to just suppress everyone, but to just have a few people that are well placed and can take care of any problems if they arise. You know, self-policing as opposed to self-suppression.
Well, you guys are definitely living up to a little bit of the viewpoint from the 50s version, which was that the pod people, the emotionlessness would lead to the end of faith. And you guys have fully convinced me that that would be something that would drop off along with some other aspects of what we do, probably more as hobbies or as ways of connecting that we wouldn't need if we were pod people. It would free up more time to put towards space and time and traveling through all these different things. I don't know. It could mean we go further, but the main thing that was really interesting with the 70s version was that they actually talked about how that was how we already evolved. That the aliens already have come and taken the apes and evolved us to what we are now, and this is the next part of our evolution, and that our evolution has been controlled by the aliens throughout time. That was a really interesting twist, I thought, that they threw in there, and it goes along with a lot of people's ideas that aliens helped build the pyramids and aliens helped do this, and I guess technically, yeah, it was us, but they evolved us. So.
Yeah, I mean, in the film, that was speculation of one of the characters' parts, and again, it fit very well with the kind of, again, San Francisco ethos of sort of the, you know, again, this sort of out there fringy type stuff. I might have liked that better if it wasn't just speculation. If the aliens had said that, then I would have had more authority. But you know, because it came from a human as speculation, I sort of wrote it off as that's just a bunch of hippy dippy new wavy bullshit. But back to the theme again, reminding ourselves that this is 1970s. It's still height of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union are pointing nuclear weapons at each other, and had things gone slightly differently, we could have eliminated all life on this planet. The aliens are saving us from that, right? I mean, we become unified, and again, and if you know, if communism had conquered the world, right? Again, that that would have been terrible in many ways, but at least it would have ended the threat of nuclear war. So, running with the McCarthyist theme from earlier. You could make the case that what matters isn't so much that that humanity and our precious individuality and all our emotions, because yeah, our emotions cause genocide, right? This is the end of genocide. There's no more genocide. There's no more war after this.
I am about to stop this broadcast because Garrett is clearly a pod person. I mean, he is making a case that is uncomfortable. I don't.
Yeah, I actually agree that there wouldn't be genocide, but I definitely think there'd be forms of eugenics that would be really fucked up. I really do think that would be part of the pod people. I mean, we can't, I'm speculating, obviously, but it just seems so obvious. And
there's slavery, right? I mean, the whole thing is a system of slavery.
Right.
So, yeah, you're getting rid of genocide, but by universalizing slavery.
There's also kind of an potential analogy to, I guess, imperialism here, in that, as was mentioned before, we sort of evolved up from apes, right? And so to sort of play on this theme in reading the movie, there's a context in which you can see it as when everything in the movie is a reflection of us in some way, shape, or form. Ultimately, even the aliens, just by the nature of narrative work. And so, what do the aliens represent in us? Of course, is the question. And I think what the aliens represent in us is the tendency to, as the aliens drift through space alone and cast off their dying world, and their only concern is basically self-preservation. And so they just happen to drift through space, they land on Earth, and it's ripe for the picking, and they're just going to eat everybody. They're just going to consume everything and make it their own home. And it doesn't matter that the people that they are, attacking are not given any choice in the matter. They are simply subsumed into the grand civilizational project that these aliens have decided to embark on. And so there's definitely an aspect of a sort of a critique of imperialism where there's this ideology. One might even take a sort of Marxist interpretation and say the capitalist ideology that just consumes people and makes them part of its system and enslaves them, where to the point where they feel like they're willing participants in the system, even though they were originally not. And then it just keeps consuming them without any regard for the personality of the other until it has completed its civilizational project.
In the book, apparently, there actually is a line in which one of the aliens says, we're just doing the same thing humans do. We're moving into a new environment. We're exploiting its resources. We're using them up. And then when we're done, we'll move on to the next one. And it's like, yeah, that's actually pretty cutting right there. It's this, maybe these things actually are more human than we feel comfortable admitting.
Well, the interesting thing about the film when it was first interpreted by people, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, Ben. I'll let you go next, I'm sorry. Is that apparently when people watch it, depending on what their political bend is, they automatically put the pod people as whatever the opposite of their political view is. That's a lot of people's interpretations when they watch it. They're like, the pod people are obviously Republicans, or they're obviously liberals. And I find that interesting that everybody politicizes the pod people. And does that mean that you're a pod person in a way in your mind think, because you're in the groupthink world? Like,
ooh, I like that. That's very meta. I like that.
That is good. And I want to take that because it comes back again. I think it was Antonio who's talking about horror as a mirror. There's a great line from Ray Bradbury, which I'm sadly going to butcher. He's talking about science fiction, but I think it can work for horror too, is that the purpose of the mirror is not to reflect back yourself. The purpose of the mirror is to reflect back over your shoulder, to see the thing that you cannot face. And then, like Perseus attacking Medusa, reach over your shoulder with the sword to cut the head off the Gorgon. And then that ties into, again, a great Bertolt Brecht quote, art is not a mirror, art is a hammer. And, especially with science fiction and also with horror, I think, again, the purpose of it isn't just to entertain or to amuse. The purpose is to somehow change us, to scar us, to make us never go back in the water, because goddamn it, that shark's out there, right? When art can have that kind of effect on you in a way that I think horror does better than a lot of other things, or on the world, which science fiction is more for the politics. It's a real testimony to the power of the written word or the moving image, spoken word. Say, pick your format, to transform our view of ourselves, our view of the world, our view of each other, right? That they're the pod people, right? They're the enemies. We start othering people like that. If the mirror is put over our shoulder rather than in our face, maybe we will actually see something that we'll see the real danger, as it were.
That's wild. That's awesome. Speaking about the political thing too, really quick, just to go back there was one scene actually where, again, Donald Sutherland's character is talking about all those different elements that might come into a person's life where you would feel like they've completely changed. And he explicitly, the very last thing that he says is like, well, maybe they became a Republican. I just want to throw that. Obviously, it's San Francisco, but just to throw that out there, I thought that was absolutely hilarious. But one question I really wanted to ask, to go back to what you said, Garrett, is about the slavery thing. So what is it? I might disagree with that a little bit, but I think I need your explanation, or at least your elaboration. What makes this full on like slavery? But what were you getting at with that piece exactly?
Well, again, it's something of an inference, but you'll notice that the second that they become pod people, every single person starts serving the pod people, right? They all point out when there's an intruder in their midst. They all run after the human being once they're discovered. They all are working on spreading the pods. So that they all have this unity of purpose. And that's something which you don't find in, you know, individualistic societies where people are free, right? People will choose to do different things. But all we see in the film is that, you know, once they're assimilated, once they become one, they have this unity of purpose, and that to me implies some kind of slavery or brainwashing or control that strips away the ability to choose otherwise.
Okay, so unity of purpose. All right. So one thing that I'm wondering here, especially as it goes back to kind of what actually happens when a person gets quote unquote assimilated. So we do have where they talk about, obviously this is where Leonard Nimoy comes in and he's giving them the sedative, and they're like, you know, what's going to happen, because they've pretty much, I guess, accepted their fate at this point. They just want to know what the experience is going to be like. But there is a preservation, or at least they say this, you know, maybe it's just one of those things where they're trying to placate the victim, but they're saying that there is a preservation of memory, of mind, and, you know, it's essentially that you're just sort of losing those pieces of you that make you unpredictable, irrational, maybe destructive, and that you're just sort of evolving as a person. Now, obviously, that's sort of contradicted by the point that Leonard Nimoy actually seems to understand what the will of the spore is. So he has their history. He knows what their motivation is, right? So there's some sort of addition that goes on there, but I'm not entirely sure if we could really call that slavery just because they're acting in a collective interest.
Yeah, no, there has to be some preservation because they are able to pretend, right? I mean, they're able to act as if they're still human. So the memories and so forth can't all be gone. Otherwise, it would have been obvious from the get-go who is a pod person and who isn't. So the memories have to be there. Some sense of the relationships have to be there, but obviously the emotional affect is gone. So yeah, it can't be a total obliteration. That can't just be a lie. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe slavery is the wrong word, but there's
definitely an element of moral erosion here as well, because you know, early in the movie the pod people are shown chasing a guy down and killing him without compunction, and presumably these aren't people who would be otherwise disposed to have done that.
No, it's not. That's not clear. That's not clear. I mean, again, we don't see what happens, but I was under the impression that the guy got hit by a car. He was running away and got hit by a car.
Yeah, but I think the implication was that he was done in, you know, in order to keep him from spreading nervousness about what was going on here.
Well, that was also a throwback to the 50s version. So the end of the 50s version had a guy doing that. The main doctor character is in traffic screaming at the cars to stop because he's trying to tell them that what happened in Santa Mira is coming to the big city because it was happening in a small town beforehand. And so he's trying to tell everybody, and there's a famous line, the most famous line from the original version is like when he points at the camera, at us, the audience, and says, "You're next. And your time is near." And he's like freaking out, and you're like, oh shit, this is really happening. We better fucking prepare. So, and then it was kind of a throwback to the 50s version. But I think they wanted to throw in that curveball at the end and let you know we're fucked by having him die. They're like, no, he didn't get to go talk to the cops and stop the pod people. It made it to the city. It made it to San Francisco. Watch how this like goes down. And you're like, oh shit, they're getting real in the 70s. Like, so that's, at least that's the way I took it. It was definitely seemed like a throwback.
Yeah, my understanding was the fellow, and I may be wrong about this, Shayra, you're probably going to have the answer to this. The fellow who knocks on the window, I think is the same fellow who gets killed.
They did make a cameo, yeah.
Yeah, that's the main dude from the 50s version. That's the main actor.
And I think that's so important that cameo was there. It's kind of like how the reason why they say the Ghostbusters movie like didn't really go that well. You want to have the cameos that helps like say, okay, we're passing the gauntlet. But you also kind of want it to, even if it's going to be its own thing, you want it to kind of be true to whatever the original was. This was trying to do the cameo thing to pass the gauntlet, and I think they did an okay job of saying, with him dying, motherfuckers, this is different. It's a little different. So we're letting you know that this went to a weird place. So I thought that was really, really clever by whoever made this film. I'm not sure. You guys might know who. Whoever made the 70s version, that was a great way of remaking a movie. Passing the gauntlet in that way lets everybody know that the creative people behind it have it and say, yeah, we're accepting of this and how it's going to take a different turn.
In terms of
I was just going to say the director of this was actually Philip Kaufman, just to throw that out there. And I feel like a lot of people sort of attribute that as the reason why this version in particular sort of stands up over the 50s version as well as all of the other remakes.
What else did he do? What were some of his other films?
No, sorry, there were a number of famous things. I'm not like super into this director in particular, but just in reading some of the reviews, it felt like a lot of praise was sort of awarded to him for this. Maybe some of the other people like in the group might know a little bit more about like his history in particular. He is sort of famous, but definitely in reading kind of like some of the reviews, they really threw it to him as being sort of his achievement.
Mm-hmm. Huh, that's interesting. And then also the director of the original 50s version, I believe, is the taxi driver in the 70s version. I guess I read something about during that scene where he's driving, he actually was in that scene driving, the director, the 50s version, who's the taxi driver in the 70s version, is actually driving in New York City during the scene where Donald Sutherland and I think it's Nancy Cartwright, one of the other ladies is in the back seat with him. And he was actually, like during the filming, was actually driving around New York City and didn't have his glasses. Like he can't see. And so the nervousness that you see from Donald Sutherland that they filmed and they captured was like legitimate nervousness. Like he didn't have his vision. And so he was driving without his glasses and they were scared. And so they actually captured part of it. It's in the film, which is kind of cool.
Okay. This dude actually apparently wrote Indiana Jones.
Kaufman did?
Yeah, I'm looking at all of the stuff.
No
It's all the
shit.
Indiana Jones shit. So that's probably what he's most famous for.
Wow. It's a hell of a thing
Yeah.
to be famous for. Wow.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
To switch gears a little bit, there was an interesting juxtaposition in the movie that I wasn't really sure what to make of, and I would really like to get you guys' feedback on what you think it represents. And that is that there's a theme in the movie of sort of, accusation, right? The pod people are following, trying to figure out who the real people are still, and accuse them, with the whole thing and all that.
That was well done.
I do that way
well
better
done.
than you. No, I'm the best at that.
Yeah.
We should all do it at the same time. Just every single one of us just except for Noah. Like Noah just sits there like he's the one being screamed at, right? We just do a screen cap,
You have to, the key is to inhale and make your throat weird.
But anyway, the
Sorry.
I have more experience with that than me.
Yeah. Sorry, Antonio. We hijacked this
movie in that both sides are trying to out each other. I don't know if any of you picked up on this, but both sides are trying to expose one another. The aliens are trying to figure out who the regular people are and chase them down and subdue them. And the regular folks are trying to figure out who the aliens are and expose them and make sure that they can subdue them. And so it's not, the aliens hunting the people or the people hunting the aliens per se. It's a mutual exercise. They're both trying to expose one another.
Yeah, the great thing is with the ending scene, it's there's something that happens there for me with Jeff Goldblum's wife. I don't know what the character's name is, sorry, but there was a thing that popped up in my head. There are a couple of movies that stand out to me because I feel like there's a whole other movie that could be made on another character's like side quest. You know what I mean? And I feel like her version of what happened during these events would have been a fantastic movie as well. So I really like that element of it where you feel like there could be another story, like in the video game Resident Evil, where there was actually two side stories. You could like play as the guy or the girl, and you're going on a completely different quest. And so when I got to the end of that, I was like, okay, now where's her version? I want to follow her.
You can Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead that shit, man. You can just write your own version.
To answer your question, Antonio, that's interesting, right? Because it makes sense in the human, the patently human context to have accusation and to have elements of being accusatory between people, even in the same group. But it's a little weird to do that from the perspective of the pod people, right? That's kind of weird to me. I mean, is it really conformist, or is it really non-emotional to be accusatory to the degree? I mean, is it just a transition until they finally get everyone being pod people and then it stops? Is it just like, is it that? Or, you know what I mean? Like, it seems inherently human to have that kind of embedded sort of accusatory framework from which you know, sort of everything subsists. I mean, it's being a human. That's a fundamental feature of being distinctly human, I think. So like, why is it just part of the time that they do it? Is it just to get everyone pod people?
You know, I think again, it's sort of trying to hold a mirror up to us and show that we are kind of the pod people in some sense. And, you know, because obviously the pod people care about some things. They do react with a violent kind of emotion towards some particular things. There's kind of a lie to when they say that, you know, we take away hate and love and blah, blah, blah. They'll absolutely flip out and chase you down at the drop of a hat, you know, with very little provocation. And so the question is, what triggers that? And in this case, it's the other in the midst. But what triggers the humans flipping out to the same degree? It's the other in the midst. And so they're kind of both. They're kind of just alternate sides of the same coin.
Well, I think what triggers the pod people is emotion, because they said they could walk amongst them as long as they didn't show any emotion, which was what made me mad at that chick so many times. She's like, ah! And I'm like, dude, that's the one thing you're not supposed to do. Like, calm down.
What the fuck was up with the dog with the human face?
Amazing scene. Amazing.
What? But this wasn't explained. You were talking earlier about how they want to explain stuff so it'll make sense. Where the hell? What was that about?
No, there's an explanation. So apparently that was the product of what's this?
Kicking the pod.
Walking into the he's walking into the health department or whatever it is, and he's walking by those people laying on the ground, and he kicks the pod and damages a little bit. So that pod was absorbing, you know, this one person that he knew, but the dog was also there. So like in that action, he kind of like messed up the process, and that's why there was that weird hybrid.
Okay.
Plus, dogs are man's best friend, Garrett. I mean, it's
that
close.
makes a lot more sense now, Ben. Thank you for that. No,
I thought he saved that guy, and I was like, he can keep playing his banjo. I'm so happy. And then he came out as a dog person, and there's a banjo playing while he's running, and I'm like, okay, how is the banjo playing? What the fuck is going on here? It was weird. This is why that film is superior, because it has its weird fucked up parts that you're just like, I don't need an explanation. I don't need to overthink this. That was fucked up. That's all that needs to be said.
Now that you do mention that, I remember being like, you know, I didn't think like he crushed the pod and like saved that guy. It seemed like, oh, let's save this guy. Oh, fuck him. Let's just walk on. Like, you know, it's like, wait a minute. You really could have helped him out. You could have just, like, you know, picked him up and carried him with you a little bit like that, like you did with all the other human beings that you encountered. Instead, they stop, they notice that he's being taken over, and then they kick the pod and then walk on. It's like, wow, that was kind of fucking weak.
You know, one of the other iconic scenes that really stuck out for me in this film was when, and we can't end this podcast without talking about it, is when Donald Sutherland killed his pod version of himself. That was super. I mean, first off, how in the name of God is this PG when he's like bashing his brains in? And actually, I read somewhere online that Stephen King, this scene stuck out to Stephen King when he watched the film as being like unbelievably brutal, one of the most brutal scenes he's ever seen in a film. And I'm like, dude, this is a PG rating. Not only that, but we got boobs. The only PG film I've ever seen with boobs, like legit boobs.
I saw those boobs and I was like, wait,
masterpiece.
Where
Antonio.
am I?
Masterpiece. You picked a masterpiece.
Are we sure this is PG? Because you're right. I'm pretty sure that the MPA.
Yeah, no, it's PG. It's a PG. It got a PG rating. Yep.
This is why we gotta love the 70s. You know?
Beautiful. God.
Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder if today we're possibly even a little bit more conservative than they were in the 70s. It's kind of interesting what turn we're sort of taking as a nation. I don't know. But yeah, just about that scene in particular, there's one other sort of like take on the film that I wanted to kind of bring it up, and it keeps coming up in every film. So maybe I can just make every film about Nietzsche. But okay, so we're talking about progress just a little bit here, right? So, you know, we can definitely think of this being a mass hysteria about progress and like, you know, things are changing, and everyone who is kind of like in the old way of thinking doesn't want things to change. So you have this individual who comes up on himself and is forced to destroy himself. And I kind of want to take that as an analogy of changing from man to overman just a little bit, like, you know, that you've got to cut that rope and kind of move forward. You know, obviously this is sort of the inversion of that a little bit, but just to throw that piece out there, that's kind of what I thought of when I saw that.
Well, if we're going to talk Nietzsche, I think the standard interpretation of Nietzsche at least would absolutely rebel against what I was saying earlier about how it might be a better world in which there's no pain and no war and stuff like that. You know, for Nietzsche, you know, what makes us best comes from that kind of conflict. You know, the pain, the suffering, the violence, that's what makes us the most human. That's when we rise above. So the idea of, it's a sort of, Sharia called it a greater good thing, is this idea that, we can, and Nietzsche was totally opposed to utilitarian sorts of, doing away with pain and suffering. So, that's yeah.
I feel like the true Nietzschean would use this opportunity as like a catalyst to make the Overman happen. Like the fact that most people would be conforming in this way would be like the stepping stone for the Overman to come about. Not through the conformity of like the pod people, but using it as a catalyst to kind of like just as the thing to step on everybody. Like, oh yeah, like this, they're all turning even more so into those cows, and now I can step upon them. Like I feel like that would be the Nietzschean angle to this.
I came across a black and white picture actually back behind the scenes of Donald Sutherland laying his head on the mannequin copy of himself. It's covered in all the sort of the tendrils and stuff like that. And it's on the one hand, it's kind of a beautiful picture. And it's kind of neat to see it backstage. On the other hand, it's creepy as fuck because the mannequin looks pretty spot on, man.
The effects in this film were great. They were absolutely fantastic. The growing of the flower, the birthing of their new selves. But that actually leads me to an interesting query. Does this mean they get to live forever, or in some form like live longer than us humans? Like, are they able to live longer? Or when when some old people die in their sleep, like would a new you be birthed and be able to live longer? Like, do we age anymore after we've become pod people? Do we like get wrinkles and stuff? Is that still part of who we are? Is it like,
how you answer that question would make me change my mind whether I would want to be a pod person or not. Seriously, that's an important question.
I was just going to ask that of Shara, actually, is that if that were the case, if you stopped aging altogether once you become a pod person, would this still be a horror, or would you be like, yeah, that's not so bad, that's a good trade, I'll do it?
I don't know. For me, like, I'm
First
fine
person
with dying. I'm ready to die when I need to die. That's just kind of the person I am. When I hear vampire stories, I think that is the ultimate, like, fuck you to a person, is to make them live forever. When I see what Wolverine deals with on his daily basis of trying to die and can't, like, I think of Groundhog's Day, him continuously trying to commit suicide and it doesn't happen. I'm like, I'm good. I don't need to live forever. That's not something I want.
I totally agree. Immortality is a curse.
So Antonio's got to leave soon. So before you go, I want you to wrap up your thoughts on this film and score it. Just give me your 2-minute. This is why it's an awesome film. Here's what I score it before you head out, and we'll continue to talk about the film you selected, because clearly you select the best fucking films. This is ridiculous. We're just going to keep going backwards in time. 78, 73, and then in 2 weeks we're doing The Seventh Seal, 1958. So we're just going to keep going backwards. The more backwards we go, the better the films seem to be getting. Anyway, go. Give me your final thoughts on this film.
Wait till you hit my recommendations from Georges Méliès. Anyway, this movie is a really great horror film. It's one of the earliest horror movies that I remember seeing. I probably saw it when I was like 6 or 7 years old, and I only saw the second half of it. So I had absolutely no idea what was going on in this movie. Crazy experience. It stuck with me a lot. But really, as you guys have probably realized by now, one of the things the thing that I consider to be a horror movie is something that is disquieting, that keeps you thinking about it and wondering about it after the movie, and sticks with you. And I think in a real sense, in both a literary and kind of an actual, like, mucus sense, this movie sticks with you. It's deeply unsettling from beginning to end in terms of the plot and its implications. As we've discussed, there's a moral ambiguity to the story where maybe the aliens aren't the bad guys and they're just icky. And that tells us something about the darkness in ourselves, the ickiness inside ourselves. It's wonderfully shot. The camera work is very unsettling, and the framing is very interesting in every single scene. Every single scene has something interesting going on in it, in the camera work. The sound design is excellent. The soundtrack is excellent. Definitely suits the theme of the film. The performances are all amazing. It's an all-star cast, blah, blah, blah. And just from beginning to end, it takes you on this journey into an increasing paranoia and increasing ickiness. And, you know, I have to emphasize, I really appreciate the fact that the movie does not have a happy ending. This is a contrast to the first movie where there is hope. And at the end of this movie, there is not. And I think it takes courage for a major motion picture to end on a note of everybody is just fucked. Like even a very bleak movie like The Witch, which we talked about recently, ends on a note where you could look at one of the characters and go, well, maybe she's making out okay in the end. No such element here. It is a tragedy in the purest sense, and because of that purity, it is a classic. It's just great from beginning to end. It's all the elements of it are very good. There's a couple, you know, cheesy elements that are common to the era that are forgivable in it, but do drag it down a little and do prevent it from aging a little. So I would give it an 8 out of 10 overall. It's absolutely still a must see. It's not a 10 out of 10 because it, you know, like I said, it just hasn't completely aged 100%. But those 8 out of 10 elements are absolutely something you should go and treat yourself to.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome summary of the film. And one thing to underscore also is not only is the end unbelievably horrifying and it doesn't end well, there's also no music in the credits, which I think is that underscore, it continues to underscore like the loss of individuality, the loss of what makes us us, right? Music and art, it's gone, it's there, it's just credits. And there's something so dry and so sterile and so awful about that even as you walk out, like if you're in a theater watching this, let's say, and you walk out, I can imagine seeing this at like an Alamo Draft House or something that plays old cinema. And they actually played this at Alamo Draft House. And so you just leave, and it's like, you leave icky. Like you use the word icky. It's a great way to put it. You just leave feeling icky. There's almost something so uniform in it when you leave. There's no individual, I don't know. Something about not having music at the end, I think underscores everything you said. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, man, great film. I'm glad you selected it. It definitely made sure that hearing those ultrasounds that I just don't ever want to have kids, because I don't ever want to hear that noise again while I'm in like a doctor's office. That's actually like that's actually the most horrifying. Everything you've been saying is very deep and important. No, just the ultrasound parts. That was the horror of this film for me. Anyway, throw it to someone else.
Hi.
So, okay, I guess I'll give my sort of summary judgment of the film. I actually was thinking the same thing as Antonio. I would give it an 8 out of 10, all things considered. I think, you know, there's a lot about the film to appreciate and to like. Yeah, it is the atmosphere, the tone is excellent. The acting is solid. You know, the concept is well done. But yeah, it's dragged down by. It wasn't so much the cheesiness for me again, as I felt just several sort of clunky shortcomings, mistakes. Like I said before, the sort of the lack of the prospect of any kind of ability that they might fight back. The lack of a clear direction for the characters to take in the third act. But you know, it still makes it a very solid, you know, upstanding horror film. Love the ending. Yeah, it's bleak as fuck and, you know, creepy. And you know, I think I probably would put it actually below The Thing in terms of the films of this genre. I think The Thing is still probably the great masterpiece on the front of, you know, of body swapping sort of horror films. But this one I think might actually come. It's definitely the best of the actual Invasion of the Body Snatchers films. I think it probably comes in the genre. Probably comes second after The Thing for me.
Yeah, I'll underscore it. I was going to give it an 8 out of 10, but I think what bumps it up to an 8.5 is the PG rating with boobs and Donald Sutherland beating his own head in. Like the fact that that's PG with those things, you get a 0.5 for that.
Fun for the whole family.
Fun for the whole family. Yeah. No, this is a great film. Look, I leave it with the loss of individualism, and how you cash that out is just, there's so many ways to do it. And I think looking historically at the fact that it's San Francisco leads you in one direction, looking at it from a completely individualistic perspective sends you in a completely different direction. But I think ultimately the thing we all sort of agree on is the very obvious, broad sort of loss of a kind of cultural identity through whatever mechanism that is, whether it's technocratic, whether it's communitarianism, fear of groupthink, the loss of artists and eccentrics, all of that stuff. There's something being lost. and there's a gaining of being essentially conformist, and there's so many different ways we could cash that out. But I think just that idea, just leaving it that generic, is horrifying enough for me. We could probably go deeper into it, but honestly, like I don't think you need to. Just that alone is horrifying. The loss of self, man. What makes you, the things you love. I'd give this an 8, but I'm going to give it an 8.5. PG, boobs, and Donald Sutherland beating his own head in. Goddamn, I'm giving it almost a higher rate. I think it is a higher rating than Antonio. Yay for PG boobs. That does it.
All right, I know Antonio's gone. I still want to give my spiel though. Obviously, like, you know, I'm just going to pull a Jeff Goldblum, and I'm still going to assert my individual and talk about my thoughts, because that's literally the most important thing to me. I didn't listen to any of you.
You are not a pod person. I love
it. All right, so there's one other thing that I definitely want to highlight here, and it seemed really interesting, or at least to me. So I'm not going to say that this movie was a super scary film to me, but potentially because I've already kind of like thought through, you know, as you mentioned, sort of like this loss of self and what that might potentially mean. And when I say that is, I've thought about what it means to be a self. I think just a little bit, as kind of like my degree in psychology kind of really sort of led me to do. You know, when we think about when somebody gets overtaken by one of the body snatchers, you know, what is it that they're actually removing, right? So we have evidence here that some of the memories are preserved. You know, some of their history is preserved, some of the personality. You know, there's some additions there. You know, they obviously know a little bit about what it is to be kind of like that pod person. They have, you know, sort of like a lack of affect. So there is a hybridization there, and there's a change. But what I wonder is it enough to say that a person sort of changes the way that they think, to say that they're an entirely different person? So, you know, obviously as a person, you can't lose like body parts and stuff and like change who you are. You know, if you lose a hand, you're still you know, and so on and so forth. But we change our minds every single day. And we have new ideologies. We have new sort of beliefs that come in, you know, and we feel differently about things as we sort of evolve. But that doesn't mean we're an entirely different person. It doesn't mean that we have lost our self. It just means we're a little bit different. And I think that might be the case here for when a body snatcher would sort of take a person over. Or at the very least show that the concept that we have of self might be a little bit sort of vapid. You know, it might not be as concrete as we actually think that it is. You know, so what is it to be a self? You know, I don't necessarily know that anything is truly lost whenever something would like take you over. So like one of these body snatchers, like I don't necessarily think it's the case that any of these people in the movie really lost themselves. It might just be the case that they've changed. So that might be why my scary rating is a little bit lower for this film, but definitely the visual aspects and the filmography, you know, it's incredible. I'm still going to rate this, I would say overall, probably about a 7. I think it's a fantastic film. You know, obviously it's going to be the best in sort of like the series of the Body Snatchers films. You know, it's great. I'm going to give it a 7. Not necessarily the scariest thing to me, but still just a fantastic film overall, and something that I would recommend that anyone who is into horror goes to watch.
Yeah, so as far as the living forever, or adding in the talk about what happens when you take away that element of your emotions and all that. So there's like a whole movement. I forgot what it's called. Oh, yeah, it's transhumanism. I have a whole bunch of friends that are in the transhumanism movement, and it's the most horrifying fucking shit in the world to me. The idea that we could take all of our thoughts and memories, put it into a computer so that we could live forever, and just keep on coming together in a form where we all have all of our accumulative thoughts in a computer with computer fast, you know, abilities. Like, whenever people start talking to me about this, I'm like, fuck no, I would not sign on to that. I'd be one of those, I'm a naturalist, I'm an old hokey, and I'm not going to be part of these games. I will be that person. I cannot latch on to that. I know what makes me who I am. It is the chemical reactions. It's smelling things and reacting to the smell. The chemical reaction of smelling your lover. It does cause things to fire off in you. That's just so fucking amazing. I don't want any part of any shit that doesn't have that in there. I refuse to be a part of it. I refuse. I will not be a part of it. Now, if I need to have my cumulative ideas put out there. That's why we have fucking books. That's how we've been on the shoulders of giants, is through writing books or even now making YouTube videos. Fine. Whatever I need to do to like continue on some legacy of mine is fine. I don't like the idea of trying to take my memories and put it into this supercomputer of groupthink. That is the most horrific thing I can think of, and that's where this movie really adds on the horror to me. I don't like the idea of being this person who looks like me, sounds like me, has the same memories as me, but just doesn't react to the world like me. I don't see how that's me.
You'll change your mind, Sharon.
Shut up, you pod people. You will not have my soul. I like it's. That is why this so much scared me. And honestly, I didn't even know of this film. I had no concept of it. I had just seen other people's, I guess, kind of idea about it and how they've like transformed this idea into something else. And no, I will have no part of this. I don't like when I watched it. I was like, nope, burn it with fire. Like I cannot.
That's so interesting. You and I have such separate views on this. Very different. Mine is the complete opposite, Chair. So that's part of the appeal to me. Is I dug the idea of, well, clarified. I think that in some ways you could cash out transhumanism or cash out the collective sort of consciousness of people and removing all of the things like negative emotion and things like that. I think those things appeal to a certain extent to me. I don't mind losing the things that make me because I don't really, and this gets really philosophically dense. And of course, Antonio and Garrett leave as soon as we discuss this. I don't really think there is a me. I mean, like that sounds insane and maybe to some extent almost self-refuting. But if we cash this out through like another 8 hours of discourse, I think that if you hold that interpretation of things, it makes it easier to digest the perspectives offered through these sort of horror films as more palatable. So that's interesting that you feel that way, because to me, I could see a scenario where like I'm on board. I would sign up. I don't like not being given the choice. I think it was you who mentioned that, or someone mentioned that as like being one of the main drivers of the conflict in this film is not having a choice. And I think that that's totally true. The problem for me was not having a choice. The problem for me also is just, the sorts of things that it's going to take away. I think some of them I'd like to keep, but I'm not averse to the idea of having myself be assimilated and removing some of the things that make me, because I don't really think there is such a thing as a me necessarily.
You are a Borg. You are pod people.
I am. As soon as they left, I had to just throw in my 2 cents and be the pod person. Now that they've all left, I'm the representative of the pod people. I'm not even
surprised by this because, a lot of the times I'm in arguments with fellow, secular or humanist or atheist, whatever labels they decide to choose themselves for. Whenever I'm in debates with people about that kind of mentality, is I have this idea of who I am that is super important to me. A lot of people have a greater good kind of mentality, and I get that. Like, I totally get that, but my individuality is of extreme importance to me. It really is. And I don't care to be cloned. I don't care to have anything like that happen to me. And now it's out there for everybody to know. It's
well, they're coming for you now. Yeah, they're coming for you. You're done.
Everybody's aware, so now I'm gonna be the first person that will be conformed to like convince all of you, I'm sure. Which sucks.
Did you guys have anything else you want to add for the film before we bounce?
Oh, I didn't rate it.
Did you? I was gonna say, I think everyone scored a say right. Yeah.
I didn't rate it. Like, seriously, this is the most horrific shit ever. Like, fuck that. I do not want to be birthed out of a plant in front of myself and while I sleep. No, like, when I'm sleeping, that is the time when you could really fuck me up, is try to do something to me when I'm sleeping. That is a plant rape while I'm sleeping. Fuck you, and fuck all of the elements of this film.
It's a good way to put it, actually. Like, plant rape.
It is. It's plant rape, just like Evil Dead. It's plant rape, and I want no part of that. I want no part of becoming a robot. I want no part of Leonard Nimoy's constant trying to take away my emotions. Like, I don't want any part of his glove. Fuck this motherfucker.
I don't want any part of his glove. That's the best.
Smell my glove. That's what I think of. This is horrific to me. And if you watch the TV show Brain Dead, as I've tried to tell you guys to go do, that takes this whole concept to the level that I consider just no. All the no's, burn it with fire, like set the whole, like, bomb America, I don't care. Get rid of whatever is going to cause us all to become these things. Like,
if you rate this like higher than The Exorcist, this has been a success to me. If you...
this is way up there for the fear factor. Like, and not because like I was like jumping. Well, I did jump when the dog human-faced thing ran out with the banjos playing. That did make me jump. It's not like a jump scare fear. It's just a very real...
Oh, it's it's a deeper fear.
It's like, this can't happen. Like, if this does happen, it needs to be burned. So, burn it to the ground, destroy the world if necessary. Elements, yeah, it's a 9.5 on fear for me. Like, fuck this film.
Wow.
I've fuck all the parts about it. It fucked my head. I had nightmares. It was not good. I don't like the idea of becoming a pod person at all.
We definitely got to send this to Antonio. That's interesting. You rated this higher than him, a whole point higher than him. That's really awesome. That's cool.
With fear, yes. With the elements of like how it is as a film, it's pretty good. I mean, it's 8. It's an 8 and felt like the cinematography is great. The end scene is iconic as fuck. So well shot. Like when you see the trees, the building, him walking down, it's just so beautiful, and it's slow moving, and you know what's coming, and then our chick from, one of his friends comes around, she's like, there you are, let's try to stop these pod people, and he's like, it's like, oh god, done. That is fantastic. It is right up there with what's in the box for me, ending to films. Fantastic shit. But it's it's a good movie all in all. It's a good, gross, icky, disgusting stuff. It made me never want to get a mud bath ever. I don't know if one of the guys was farting in there while he was reading his muddy book. I don't
It's what
know
you do in a mud bath. You just fart and watch the bubbles and giggle.
In there, like I don't ever want a mud bath. And my daughter, when we were watching it, she was like, "What are they even doing?" I'm like, "It was a thing people did. They did mud baths, but maybe this film is what turned everybody off of it because this is just nasty. It ruined the mud bath industry." So.
That's awesome. I really like the fact that you rated this so high. You rated it in terms of the fear factor, where it follows is for me. That was the highest rating I gave at 9.5.
This horrifies me. The idea, awesome. The concept fucking horrifies me. When the new remake of this comes out, I'm looking forward to it. And
Shayra, and I'm glad I get to do this now. Motherfucker. That is your fear schema. Your fear schema is, remember, and it goes back to The Exorcist being supplanted by the next generation, which itself sort of is a sense of like losing individualism, losing you, right? And in Exorcist, the fear is losing you, at least part of it is losing you through the next generation, being supplanted by the next generation. Except in this film, you're not supplanted by the next generation, you're supplanted by you. So that's awesome. That's starting. You're starting to get like a formation of what does it for you. Yeah. Don't erase me. There you go. I like that.
Don't fucking erase me. It's not okay. So yeah,
that's awesome.
I had no idea about this film, so it's exciting to find something that is old that horrifies me to this end. I'm like, ooh. These are new feelings. I like this.
Yeah, I feel like we should keep going backwards. I think we're gonna pursue this. And I guess I'll just use this as a segue to end it because I want to talk a little bit about this. Ben, did you have anything else you wanted to say? Are you good?
I think I pretty thoroughly had my say. Yeah, so totally good.
Cool. So next week we are doing, or not next week, 2 weeks from tonight, actually, we're doing The Seventh Seal, Ingmar Bergman, 1958, 57, 58, 58. Have not seen it. This is Ben's. I really want to magnify this as the one Ben has talked about in most every other session. So I'm really, really interested to see this. It is about a knight who has a chess game with death in the midst of the Black Plague, which sounds like a fucking awesome. Right away, that sounds amazing. It sounds deep and it sounds profound, and I can't wait to watch it. And it's 1958. So I think what we'll do is in 2 weeks, we're going to take a break next week. 2 weeks from now, we'll do Seventh Seal. And then the week after that, we're going to do The Phantom Carriage. We're just going to keep going backwards. I am
so excited.
Yeah, what is Phantom Carriage here?
Oh, geez, it's in the 30s, I think.
Yeah, 1930 something.
But it is fantastically creepy. I love it.
Yeah. So we'll just keep going backwards. I feel like going backwards has it's a little antithetical to the goal of the podcast, but it feels better. No, it does. it's just been a better, it's been a real good experiment. I mean, I started this by having this kind of like la-di-da current horror films, let's find the good ones. But if it's true that if you go back, there are some ones that like the good shit today, those same fears are exacerbated in ways that may be better in the 70s and 80s and apparently 50s. And we're just going to keep going back. Let's see the decade that just, it's no longer scary. Let's just keep going backwards to when they first have cinema and see how far we can go.
Just go to the very first one where we go to the moon and there's crazy monsters that attack you, and the only way to destroy them is with umbrellas. I know it's only like a 10-minute film, but oh my gosh, how horrific.
That probably hits some deep existential shit that we're just not privy to right now. But yeah, we're gonna do it. We're gonna go backwards. So yeah, thank you for watching the session tonight, 1978, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. 2 weeks from now, Seven Seal. Week after that, Phantom Carriage. And then we'll probably, at that point, go back to more current films. Maybe. Who knows? Who knows? We may just go backwards. Keep going backwards. Anyway, thank you for watching. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And we had a good amount of viewers this time. I think we had about 3 or 4 the whole time, which was awesome. So feel free to check us out on our social media. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.